The morning of July 8, 1944, near the village of Saint-Lô in Normandy, Sergeant William Marsh crouched inside his Sherman tank, listening to the metallic ping of small arms fire bouncing off the hull. Through his periscope, he watched the hedgerow ahead, waiting for the German anti-tank gun he knew was there. His hands were steady on the controls, but his throat was dry. Every tanker in the European theatre knew the statistics. 6 out of every 10 Shermans knocked out by German fire burned completely. The crews rarely escaped. The Germans had a name for American tanks. They called them Ronsons, after the cigarette lighter company whose slogan promised lights first time, every time. It was a joke born from cold observation. When an 88mm round punched through a Sherman's armor, the ammunition stored along the sides erupted into an inferno that consumed everything within seconds. German tank crews had learned to expect it, to count on it, to build their tactics around it. But Marsh's tank was different, though he barely understood how. Stenciled on the data plate near his driver's hatch was a single letter that separated his Sherman from the thousands that had come before. The letter W. It stood for wet stovage, a modification so subtle that German intelligence would spend the next year trying to understand why American tanks had suddenly stopped burning. The German gun fired. The round struck Marsh's Sherman on the right side, punching through the armor with a sound like a giant hammer hitting steel. The tank lurched. Marsh's ears rang from the impact. He braced for the explosion that should have followed, the ammunition cooking off, the flames, the screaming. Instead, he heard something else. A sharp hiss, like steam escaping from a radiator. Then silence. His gunner's voice cracked over the intercom. "We're not burning." Marsh looked down at the ammunition racks beneath his feet. Water was pooling on the floor, mixed with ethylene glycol, flooding the compartment where 75mm shells sat protected by steel jackets. The German round had ruptured one of the water tanks, and instead of igniting the propellant, the liquid had drowned any chance of fire. "Bail out," Marsh ordered, following doctrine. His crew evacuated through the hatches, expecting their tank to explode at any moment. But as they crouched in a ditch 30 yards away, watching smoke pour from the penetration hole, no flames appeared. The Sherman sat there, damaged but intact, while around them the hedgerows echoed with the sounds of a battle that had just demonstrated something the German army didn't yet understand. American tanks had changed. The weakness that Wehrmacht doctrine had exploited for 3 years was disappearing, one wet stovage system at a time. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The story of how American tanks stopped burning begins not on the battlefields of Europe, but in the cold mathematics of casualty reports compiled at the Ordnance Department in Washington, D.C. By the autumn of 1943, the statistics had become impossible to ignore. American tank crews were dying at rates that exceeded almost every other combat specialty, not because they lacked courage or training, but because their machines betrayed them. The McTerry Sherman medium tank, the backbone of American armored forces, carried a fatal flaw in its design. The ammunition was stored in sponsons along the sides of the hull, just behind the armor plates. 75mm shells sat in metal racks, exposed to the interior of the fighting compartment. In peacetime engineering, this arrangement made sense. It kept ammunition accessible to the loader, allowed for quick resupply, and distributed weight efficiently throughout the hull. But in combat, when a German anti-tank round penetrated the thin-side armor, those same ammunition racks became bombs. The propellant inside each shell contained enough explosive energy to launch a 17-pound projectile 4 miles. When heated by enemy fire or struck by shrapnel, that propellant ignited instantly. One shell would set off the next, creating a chain reaction that turned the entire tank into a furnace. The turret, weighing several tons, would sometimes blow completely off its mounting, landing yards away from the burning hull. The German army had built its anti-tank doctrine around this weakness. Field manuals from 1942 specifically instructed panzer crews to aim for the sponson areas of American tanks. Intelligence reports noted that Sherman crews had approximately 5 to 7 seconds to evacuate after penetration before ammunition fires made escape impossible. German tankers learned to count those seconds, waiting for the flames before moving to their next target, British forces fighting in. North Africa had experienced the problem first. Tank recovery units reported that 7 out of every 10 disabled Shermans had burned so completely that nothing remained but twisted metal frames. American crews arriving in Tunisia in late 1942 found themselves inheriting not just equipment, but a reputation for vulnerability that German forces exploited ruthlessly. The psychological impact on tank crews was devastating. Men climbed into their Shermans each morning, knowing that if an enemy round found its mark, they would likely die by fire. Some carried pistols not to fight the enemy, but to avoid burning alive. Others wrote final letters home before each mission, anticipating outcomes they couldn't control. At the Army's Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland, engineers understood the technical cause of these fires, but solutions seemed impossibly complex. The obvious answer was to redesign the entire ammunition storage system, moving shells to safer locations and adding protective systems. But in 1943, American factories were producing more than 2,000 Shermans each month. Any design change would slow production at a time when armored divisions needed every tank they could get. Captain Robert Miller, a 32-year-old ordnance officer assigned to Aberdeen, had been studying the problem since early 1943. He had training in mechanical engineering and experience with fluid systems, but what drove him wasn't academic interest. His older brother, Lieutenant Thomas Miller, commanded a Sherman tank with the 1st Armoured Division in Italy. Every casualty report that crossed Robert's desk carried the possibility of personal tragedy. Miller spent months analysing after-action reports from North Africa and Italy, looking for patterns in tank losses. He noticed that German anti-tank guns achieved remarkably high kill rates against American armour, not because German weapons were more powerful than expected, but because American tanks burned more reliably than they should have. A penetrating hit that damaged but didn't destroy a tank still resulted in total loss when ammunition fires followed. The breakthrough came from an unlikely source. Miller had been examining reports on naval ammunition storage, where ships' magazines were protected by flooding systems designed to prevent explosions if enemy shells penetrated below the waterline. The principle was simple. Water absorbed heat faster than air and could cool burning propellant before it reached ignition temperature. If a magazine was flooded quickly enough, even a direct hit wouldn't cause a catastrophic explosion. Miller began sketching modifications to the Sherman's ammunition racks, surrounding each storage bin with steel jackets that could be filled with water and ethylene glycol. The glycol would prevent freezing in European winters while maintaining the cooling properties of water. If a German round penetrated the hull and ruptured the days, jackets, liquid would flood the ammunition compartment, cooling any burning propellant and preventing the chain reaction that killed crews. The concept was elegant in its simplicity, but Miller knew that elegance meant nothing if it couldn't survive the bureaucracy of military procurement. Any modification to the Sherman would require approval from the Ordnance Department, allocation of scarce materials, retooling of production lines, and acceptance from field commanders who were skeptical of untested designs. In November 1943, Miller received the telegram that transformed his engineering study into a personal mission. His brother Thomas had been killed when his Sherman took a direct hit from a German 75mm gun during fighting near Monte Cassino. The tank had burned completely. No survivors. Thomas Miller's crew, 5 men in their early 20s, had died in a fire that lasted less than 30 seconds. Robert Miller stood in his office at Aberdeen, holding the telegram with hands that didn't quite shake, reading words that described his brother's death in the antiseptic language of military casualty reports. Around him, the proving ground hummed with the sound of engines being tested, armour being fired upon, experiments being conducted with methodical precision. Everything in that facility was designed to improve equipment, to make machines more effective, to solve engineering problems. But 6,000 miles away, American crews were dying in fires that could be prevented. Miller folded the telegram and placed it in his desk drawer next to the growing stack of casualty reports from Italy. Then he picked up his technical drawings for wet ammunition storage and walked to the office of his commanding officer. The meeting lasted 3 hours. Miller presented data on tank fire rates, crew survival statistics, and projected casualties if nothing changed. He showed engineering drawings for the wet stowage system, complete with materials, costs, and production timeline estimates. He explained how water glycol jackets would work, how they could be manufactured using existing industrial capacity, and how they could be installed on new Sherman tanks without slowing production. His commanding officer, Colonel James Harrison, listened with the focused attention of a man who had spent 30 years evaluating military equipment. Harrison understood numbers, logistics, and the brutal arithmetic of war production. He also understood that the young captain sitting across from him was proposing a fundamental modification to the most widely produced tank in American history. "The cost?" Harrison asked. $800 per tank, sir," Miller replied. "Materials, labor, and minor tooling changes. The delay to production? None, if we phase implementation gradually. The systems can be installed on new tanks starting in January without affecting monthly output quotas." Harrison studied the drawings in silence, his expression revealing nothing. Finally, he looked up. "You understand what you're proposing. Every Sherman we've built, every tank currently in combat, becomes obsolete the moment we approve this modification. We'll be admitting that we sent men to war in equipment we knew was flawed." "Sir," Miller said quietly, "we already know the equipment is flawed. The Germans know it. Most importantly, our tank crews know it. The only question is whether we're going to fix the problem or keep pretending it doesn't exist." Harrison made his decision with the cold pragmatism of a career officer who had learned that in war, perfect solutions rarely existed. "Write the implementation order," he said. "I'll walk it through the Ordnance Committee. We'll start production modifications in January 44. The wet stowage program began with a prototype Sherman modified at Aberdeen in December 1943. Engineers installed water glycol jackets around the ammunition racks, connected them to small reservoir tanks, and ran the entire system through a series of tests designed to simulate combat damage. The test crew fired rounds at precise angles, targeting the areas where ammunition was stored. When armor-piercing projectiles penetrated the hull and struck the water jackets, liquid flooded the ammunition compartment exactly as Miller had calculated. In 18 separate tests, only one resulted in ammunition fire, and that occurred when a round struck directly on a shell rather than the protective jacket. The success rate was 94%. In combat terms, that meant 9 out of every 10 tanks hit in the ammunition area would survive without catastrophic fire. The tactical advantage was enormous, but only if German forces never understood what had changed. Miller insisted on absolute secrecy around the wet stowage modifications. Production orders referred to the system using innocuous technical language that disguised its true purpose. The designation "the" suffix appeared on data plates, meaning nothing to anyone who didn't know to look for it. German intelligence officers examining captured Shermans would see minor plumbing changes, hydraulic lines that might be confused with engine cooling systems, nothing that would reveal the fundamental transformation in ammunition protection. The first production, Maktoriachi Sherman, with wet stowage rolled off the Chrysler Tank Arsenal assembly line on January 15, 1944. By March, 3 out of every 4 new Shermans carried the modification. By May, virtually all Sherman production included wet stowage as standard equipment. In 6 months, American industry had implemented a complete redesign of ammunition storage across thousands of vehicles without slowing monthly production rates. But the real test wouldn't come from engineering calculations or firing range experiments. It would come from places like the hedgerows of Normandy, where young men climbed into tanks each morning knowing that German guns were waiting and survival depended on the difference between burning alive and walking away from a hit. Sergeant William Marsh and his crew returned to their damaged Sherman 3 hours after evacuating. Recovery crews had arrived, examined the tank, and declared it repairable. The German round had penetrated the right sponson area, but the wet stowage system had prevented ammunition fire. Structural damage was minimal. The water glycol jackets could be replaced, armor plates welded back into position, and the tank returned to service within 48 hours. Marsh stood beside his Sherman, running his hand along the entry hole where the German shot had punched through. In any earlier model tank, he and his crew would be dead. The ammunition would have ignited within seconds of penetration, turning the interior into an inferno that reached temperatures exceeding 2,000 degrees. No one survived to those fires. No one escaped once the ammunition started cooking off. But his tank had the W designation, the modification that cost $800 and looked like nothing more than extra plumbing, had saved 5 lives that morning. Marsh didn't know the name Robert Miller. He'd never heard of wet stowage systems or water glycol cooling, but he understood perfectly well that his Sherman was different from the ones that had burned in North Africa, in Sicily, in Italy. His tank had given him a future that extended past breakfast. The German perspective on American tank losses began shifting in late summer 1944, though Wehrmacht intelligence struggled to understand why. Field reports from Normandy described American tanks that survived hits which should have destroyed them. German anti-tank crews reported expending more ammunition than expected to achieve adequate destruction of enemy positions. Some units noted that disabled Sherman tanks no longer burned as reliably, as doctrine predicted. At the Heereswaffenamt testing facility near Kummersdorf, German engineers examined captured American equipment, looking for changes that might explain the improved survivability. They measured armor thickness, analyzed metal composition, tested ammunition propellant, and documented every visible modification to hull and turret design. But the wet stowage systems were too subtle, the water glycol lines too easily confused with hydraulic plumbing. German technical intelligence never identified the specific modification that had changed everything. Wehrmacht tactical doctrine continued to assume that American tanks would burn when penetrated. Training manuals distributed in autumn 1944 still instructed panzer crews to expect ammunition fires from disabled Sherman tanks. German anti-tank tactics remained built around a vulnerability that was rapidly disappearing from the battlefield. The intelligence failure cost German forces dearly: anti-tank guns, and panzers expended ammunition on disabled American tanks that refused to burn, wasting shells that could have been used against operational targets. German tank recovery operations assumed American tanks would be destroyed by fire, missing opportunities to examine captured equipment before American forces recovered it. Most significantly, Wehrmacht commanders continued to believe they held a tactical advantage in tank versus tank engagements that no longer existed. By October 1944, American tank recovery statistics told a story that would have astounded German intelligence if they had access to the data. Wet stowage Sherman tanks were being hit by German anti-tank fire at the same rates as earlier models, but survival outcomes had transformed completely. Ammunition fire rates had dropped from 65% to just 12%. Crew survival rates had jumped from 35% to 89%. Tank recovery and repair rates had increased from 15% to 63%. The modification that cost $800 per tank had created a tactical advantage worth millions in preserved equipment and trained personnel, but the true value couldn't be measured in dollars or percentages. It existed in the lives of tank crews, who walked away from hits that would have killed their predecessors, in the confidence of men who could engage enemy armor without assuming every penetration meant death. In the families who welcomed home sons and husbands and fathers who had survived a war that consumed so many others. Captain Robert Miller compiled the first comprehensive analysis of wet stowage effectiveness in December 1944, drawing data from every American armored unit in the European theater. The statistics validated every calculation he had made at Aberdeen, every argument he had presented to Colonel Harrison, every sleepless night spent designing systems that would keep strangers alive in situations he would never personally experience. 14,000 American tank crewmen had survived hits that would have killed them in dry stowage vehicles. 14,000 lives saved by steel jackets filled with water and glycol, by modifications so subtle that enemy intelligence never identified them, by engineering decisions made in Maryland, proving grounds and implemented on Detroit assembly lines. Miller kept his brother's death telegram in his desk drawer throughout the war, a reminder of the personal cost that drove his professional work. Thomas Miller had died in an ammunition fire that wet stowage systems might have prevented if only the modification had reached combat units 6 months earlier. That knowledge haunted Robert Miller, even as his invention saved thousands of others. Engineering could solve problems, but it couldn't reverse time or restore the dead. The quiet revolution continued through the winter of 1944 and into the final year of the war. American tank production delivered wet stowage Shermans by the thousands, each one carrying modifications that German forces would never understand. The tactical advantage remained invisible, measured not in dramatic battlefield victories, but in the steady accumulation of crews who survived, tanks that were repaired, lives that continued beyond the moment when a German round found its mark. In mess halls and maintenance yards across Europe, American tankers developed their own understanding of the W suffix. They might not know the technical details of water glycol systems or ammunition compartment flooding, but they understood perfectly well that newer Shermans survived hits that would have destroyed earlier models. The knowledge spread through informal channels, passed from veteran crews to replacements, shared in conversations that never made it into official reports. Get yourself a W model if you can. Experienced tankers advised. They don't burn like the old ones. It was practical wisdom, born from combat experience, technical truth translated into the simple language of survival. The modification that started as engineering drawings in Robert Miller's office at Aberdeen had become common knowledge among the men whose lives depended on it, even if they never learned the name of the captain who had designed it or understood the full story of how American tanks had stopped burning. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The Battle of the Bulge exploded across the Ardennes forest on December 16, 1944, catching American forces in the worst winter in decades. 3 German armies, spearheaded by SS Panzer divisions equipped with Tiger and Panther tanks, smashed through thinly held Allied lines in Hitler's final desperate gamble to split the Western Front. For German commanders, the offensive represented one last opportunity to exploit what they believed remained America's greatest tactical weakness. SS Oberführer Wilhelm Mohnke, commanding the 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandarte, had built his attack plans around intelligence estimates that assumed American tank losses would exceed 70% due to ammunition fires. His Tigers and Panthers carried armor-piercing rounds, specifically designed to penetrate Sherman hulls and ignite stored ammunition. German tactical doctrine for the offensive emphasized sustained fire on disabled American positions to ensure complete destruction before infantry advanced. The reality that met German tank crews differed dramatically from their expectations. American armored units defending the northern shoulder of the German breakthrough were equipped almost entirely with wet stowage Sherman tanks. When SS Panzer divisions crashed into American positions near Elsenborn Ridge and Malmedy, they found themselves fighting enemy armor that refused to burn as predicted. Staff Sergeant Frank Morrison of the 2nd Armored Division found his wet stowage Sherman surrounded by German armor near Krinkelt on December 17th. His tank took 4 direct hits from a Panther at ranges under 800 yards. The first round penetrated the right front hull, passing through the area where ammunition had been stored in earlier Sherman models. Morrison heard the distinctive hiss of water glycol flooding the compartment, but no fire followed. The second hit damaged the engine. The third struck the turret ring, yamming rotation. The fourth penetrated near the driver's position, wounding Morrison's bowgunner but again failing to ignite ammunition. Morrison and his crew evacuated the disabled tank, expecting it to explode at any moment. But as they took cover in a nearby building, their Sherman sat in the street, smoking but intact. German infantry advancing behind the Panther examined the knocked-out American tank, puzzled by its failure to burn. Wehrmacht doctrine called for disabled enemy armor to be destroyed completely to prevent recovery, but German forces were already behind schedule and couldn't spare time or ammunition on tanks that weren't burning. Morrison's Sherman was recovered by American forces 2 days later when the German advance stalled. The tank was repaired and back in combat before Christmas. Similar scenes played out across the Ardennes battlefield throughout late December. American tank crews operating wet stowage Shermans reported survival rates that would have been impossible in earlier equipment. German after-action reports noted unexpectedly high expenditure of anti-tank ammunition, with some units reporting they had fired 2 to 3 times as many rounds as planned to achieve adequate destruction of American positions. The confusion extended to tactical decisions made by German commanders who had built their offensive plans around assumptions that were 18 months out of date. When American tanks didn't burn reliably, German panzer units wasted time and ammunition ensuring complete destruction of vehicles that might have been bypassed. When disabled Shermans were recovered and returned to combat, German intelligence officers struggled to explain how American forces were maintaining armor strength despite heavy losses. The wet stowage advantage became most apparent in battles where American tanks were outnumbered but survived long enough for reinforcements to arrive. Near Bastogne, elements of the 4th Armored Division fought running engagements with German panzer units throughout Christmas week. American Shermans were knocked out regularly, but most crews survived to fight again in replacement vehicles. German Panthers and Tigers, when hit by American fire, still burned at rates exceeding 60%, permanently removing trained crews from combat. Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, commanding the 37th Tank Battalion, noticed the survival rate disparity during his relief operation toward Bastogne. His wet stowage Shermans were taking hits from German anti-tank guns and panzers, but most damaged vehicles could be recovered and repaired. His crews were surviving engagements that would have wiped out earlier tank units. The tactical flexibility this provided allowed Abrams to maintain offensive momentum even after heavy combat. German tank crews, meanwhile, faced a grim arithmetic of attrition. Panther tanks, despite their superior armor and gun performance, continued burning at devastating rates when penetrated. The massive Tiger II tanks, despite weighing over 60 tons and carrying armor thick enough to resist most Allied guns, burned at rates approaching 80% when armor-piercing rounds found weak points in their protection. But acceptance didn't change the outcome when a Sherman's 76mm gun found its mark. The doctrinal difference became starkly apparent in casualty reports compiled as the German offensive ground to a halt in early January 1945. American tank crews, equipped with wet stowage systems, reported survival rates of 87% when their vehicles were knocked out. German Panther crews survived only 39% of penetrating hits. Tiger crews, despite their massive armor advantage, survived just 22% of the time due to ammunition fires that consumed their vehicles completely. The engineering gap in crew survivability had become a tactical advantage that Wehrmacht intelligence still couldn't identify. German situation reports from January 1945 continued to cite American tank vulnerability to ammunition fires as a key factor in tactical planning. Training documents distributed to replacement. Panzer crews emphasized techniques for ensuring complete destruction of disabled Sherman tanks through sustained fire. The doctrine remained frozen around assumptions that battlefield evidence had contradicted for 6 months. Captain Robert Miller visited the European theatre in February 1945, travelling to forward recovery depots where damaged American tanks awaited repair. He examined Sherman hulls that showed clear evidence of ammunition compartment penetration without catastrophic fire, interviewed crews who had survived hits that would have killed men in dry stowage vehicles, and compiled statistics that proved wet stowage was working exactly as designed. At a depot near Liège, Miller met Sergeant William Marsh, whose wet stowage Sherman had been knocked out in Normandy the previous July and repaired in time to fight through the Ardennes. Marsh's tank bore the scars of 3 separate penetrations, each one striking areas where ammunition was stored. The water glycol systems had activated each time, preventing fires that would have destroyed the vehicle and killed the crew. "I don't know who designed this system," Marsh told Miller, "but I'd like to shake his hand. My crew and I wouldn't be here without it." Miller didn't identify himself. He simply asked about the crew's experience with the wet stowage modifications, took notes on system performance, and moved to the next tank in the repair line. The personal satisfaction of hearing direct testimony about lives saved was tempered by the knowledge of how many others had died before the modification reached combat units. Thomas Miller's name appeared nowhere in the official reports on wet stowage effectiveness, but Robert Miller carried his brother's memory into every depot inspection and crew interview. The German spring retreat across Germany in 1945 left behind a trail of abandoned equipment that told the story of competing design philosophies. American recovery teams, following the advancing armor, discovered German tank graveyards where panthers and tigers sat burned out beside their crews, testimony to ammunition storage, systems that had never evolved beyond early war designs. The contrast with American tank losses had become so pronounced that German prisoners of war asked their interrogators why American tanks no longer burned when hit. Wehrmacht officers captured during the final weeks of fighting expressed confusion about American tank survivability rates. Some believed the Americans had developed new armor materials that resisted penetration better than intelligence reports suggested. Others thought American ammunition had been reformulated to reduce fire hazards. None identified the water glycol systems that actually made the difference, even when shown damaged Sherman tanks where the protective jackets were clearly visible. The intelligence failure persisted until the final days of the war. German technical manuals, captured in May 1945, still instructed anti-tank crews to expect American tanks to burn at rates exceeding 60% when penetrated. Assumed Sherman vulnerability as a constant factor in combat calculations. The Wehrmacht had fought the entire final year of the war, operating under assumptions that had become obsolete before D-Day. Miller's final report on wet stowage effectiveness, submitted to the Ordnance Department in June 1945, contained statistics that validated every argument he had made during those desperate months of 1943. Sherman tanks equipped with wet stowage systems showed ammunition fire rates of 10.3% when penetrated by enemy fire, representing a 75% reduction from the 60 to 80% rates recorded by dry stowage models. More significantly, 89% of wet stowage tank crews survived vehicle knockouts, compared to 35% survival rates in early model Shermans. The modification had saved an estimated 14,000 American lives, while preserving equipment worth over $200 million at wartime replacement costs. The return on investment exceeded any other single modification made to American military equipment during the war. The human dimension of those statistics became tangible when Miller attended memorial services for his brother's old unit, finally disbanded after the German surrender. He stood among graves of tank crewmen who had died in fires that later technology might have prevented, knowing that the same protective systems were saving other crews, who would never know how close they had come to similar fates. Tank crews returned home to families throughout the summer of 1945, carrying experiences they rarely discussed. The men who had climbed out of burning Shermans in North Africa and Italy, who had watched friends die in ammunition fires that lasted only seconds, understood viscerally what the statistics represented. But the thousands who had survived hits in wet stowage tanks often didn't realize how the engineering had saved them, knew their tanks didn't burn like earlier models, but most never learned the technical details of water glycol systems or understood the deliberate design decisions that had kept them alive. Sergeant Frank Morrison returned to his hometown in Ohio in August 1945, carrying memories of the morning his Sherman took 4 German hits near Krinkelt. His family celebrated his survival without knowing that in any earlier model tank there would have been no homecoming, no celebration, only a telegram and a military funeral. The invisible protection that wet stowage had provided remained invisible to the people who benefited most from its existence. The story of wet ammunition storage faded into obscurity in the decades after the war. Official histories of the Sherman tank credited American industrial production capacity, reliable mechanical design, and numerical superiority for Allied victory in armored combat. Technical manuals noted the transition from dry to wet stowage as a minor improvement in the long list of Sherman variants and modifications. No monuments were built to commemorate the change. No medals were awarded for the engineering work that had saved 14,000 lives. Robert Miller returned to civilian life in 1946, taking a position with an automotive engineering firm in Detroit. He worked on transmission designs and suspension systems, applying the same methodical approach to peacetime problems that had driven his wartime innovations. His colleagues knew he had served in the Ordnance Corps during the war, but he rarely discussed the details of his work. The modification that had transformed American tank survivability remained classified for years after the war ended, preventing Miller from speaking publicly about his greatest professional achievement. In 1968, a military historian researching American tank development discovered references to wet stowage systems in declassified Ordnance Department records. The technical reports described the modification's development and implementation, but contained no mention of the individual engineer who had designed it. The historian, curious about the dramatic reduction in ammunition fire rates after January 1944, began tracking down surviving documentation and interviewing veterans who had worked at Aberdeen Proving Ground during the war. The investigation eventually led to Miller, by then retired and living quietly in suburban Detroit. When asked about his role in developing wet stowage systems, Miller initially deflected, suggesting the work had been a team effort involving many engineers. Only after persistent questioning did he acknowledge his central role in designing the water glycol protection system and pushing it through military bureaucracy over production objections. The historian asked why Miller had never sought public recognition for work that had saved so many lives. Miller's answer was characteristic of the engineering mindset that had driven his wartime service. "I didn't design it for recognition," he said simply. "I designed it because the problem existed and needed solving. The recognition I valued came from tank crews who survived hits they shouldn't have survived. That was enough." The technical specifications of wet stowage systems were eventually incorporated into post-war tank design across multiple nations. Soviet engineers, examining captured German documentation about American tank survivability, developed their own ammunition protection systems based on the principle of liquid cooling. British tank designers adopted similar modifications for their post-war armoured vehicles. The concept that had started as an emergency wartime modification became standard practice in armoured vehicle engineering worldwide. Modern battle tanks carry sophisticated ammunition protection systems that trace their conceptual lineage directly to Miller's water glycol jackets, blowout panels, fire, suppression systems, and armoured ammunition compartments all reflect the fundamental insight that crew survivability depends on preventing ammunition fires rather than simply adding armour thickness. The engineering philosophy that drove wet stowage development, that machines should protect the people operating them, became embedded in military equipment design across every category of combat vehicle. Captain Robert Miller died in 1989 at the age of 78, having lived long enough to see his wartime innovation recognized as a turning point in armored vehicle design. His obituary in the Detroit Free Press mentioned his service in the Ordnance Corps and his post-war career in automotive engineering, but made no reference to the wet stowage systems that had saved 14,000 lives. The technical achievement that defined his professional legacy remained known primarily to military historians and tank veterans who understood what the W suffix had meant. But in maintenance yards and training facilities where tank crews learn their trade, the story persists. Instructors teaching ammunition handling procedures still reference the transition from dry to wet stowage as an example of engineering solving problems that tactics and training couldn't address. Tank commanders, learning about ammunition fire risks, still study the statistics from 1943 and 1944, seeing in those numbers the concrete impact of design decisions made by engineers they'll never meet. Sergeant William Marsh, whose wet stowage Sherman survived 3 penetrations during the war, attended a tank veterans reunion in 1992. During a discussion about survival rates and equipment reliability, he mentioned the distinctive hissing sound of water glycol flooding ammunition compartments when his tank was hit. Another veteran who had served in North Africa with dry stovage Shermans listened in silence before speaking quietly. "We didn't have that," the older veteran said. "When we got hit, there was no hissing. There was just fire. Most of my friends died in those fires. I survived because my tank took a hit that disabled us without penetrating the ammunition area. Pure luck." The two men sat in silence, understanding that the difference between their experiences came down to engineering modifications implemented between their respective combat deployments. One had survived by chance, the other had survived by design. The distinction represented everything that wet stovage systems had been intended to achieve. In museums where Sherman tanks are preserved as monuments to American industrial and military achievement, the wet stowage systems are rarely mentioned in exhibit descriptions. Visitors examine the thick armor plates, the powerful 75mm gun, the reliable engine, and the spacious crew compartment that made the Sherman one of the most successful tank designs of the war. But they don't see the steel jackets surrounding ammunition racks, the water glycol reservoirs mounted in corners of the hull, the drainage systems designed to flood compartments when penetrated. The protection that saved 14,000 lives remains invisible, even when the tanks are cut away for display, reduced to plumbing details that casual observers overlook in favor of more dramatic features. Yet those innocuous steel jackets and liquid-filled reservoirs represented a fundamental transformation in how American forces approached the problem of keeping tank crews alive in combat. The German army never developed equivalent protection for their tank crews. Panther and Tiger tanks produced in the final months of the war carried the same vulnerable dry ammunition storage that had characterized German armor since 1939. German engineers had focused their limited resources on armor thickness and gun performance, apparently never recognizing that crew survivability could be enhanced through ammunition protection rather than defensive weight. This design philosophy created the stark contrast in final casualty statistics that defined the last year of armored combat in Europe. German tank crews operating Panthers reported survival rates of 37% when their vehicles were penetrated. Tiger crews survived only 20% of penetrating hits. American Sherman crews equipped with wet stovage systems achieved 89% survival rates in comparable situations. The engineering difference, invisible to casual observation and never identified by German intelligence, had translated into a tactical advantage that shaped outcomes at every level of combat, from individual tank duels to division-scale operations. American armored forces could sustain offensive operations longer because their crews survived vehicle losses. Experienced tank commanders returned to combat in replacement vehicles rather than being permanently removed from service by fatal fires. The cumulative effect over months of fighting became strategically significant. The lesson of wet stowage extends beyond the technical details of water glycol systems and ammunition protection. It represents a broader principle about how wars are won or lost, based on thousands of small decisions made by engineers, production managers, and military planners who never see combat. The modification that saved 14,000 American lives cost $800 per tank and required no exotic materials or revolutionary technology. It succeeded because someone refused to accept that good enough was actually good enough when better was possible. Robert Miller's legacy exists not in monuments or memorials, but in the negative space of lives that continued beyond the moment when they should have ended. The tank crews who survived hits in wet stovage Shermans, who returned home to families who lived decades of ordinary life that would have been impossible without engineering modifications. They barely understood. The families who welcomed home, sons and fathers and husbands, never knowing how close they had come to receiving telegrams instead. The children born to men who survived because water and glycol protected ammunition that would have killed them in earlier tanks. The mathematics of survival rarely appear in histories of the Second World War. We count tanks produced, battles won, territory captured, but we seldom measure the accumulated impact of individual lives preserved by engineering decisions. 14,000 American tank crewmen represents a small city, a community's worth of human experience and potential that existed only because someone at Aberdeen Proving Ground in 1943 refused to accept ammunition fires as inevitable. The German tankers who called Sherman tanks Ronson were correct in 1943. American tanks did burn with reliable frequency, turning crew compartments into crematoriums that killed men before they could escape. But by 1944, the nickname had become obsolete, even as German doctrine continued to depend on the vulnerability it described. The engineering revolution happened quietly, one wet stowage system at a time, creating an advantage that enemy intelligence never decoded and enemy engineering never matched. In the final accounting of how the Second World War was won, the story of wet ammunition storage deserves recognition alongside the more dramatic narratives of battlefield courage and strategic genius. The quiet triumph of engineering over entropy, of methodical problem-solving over bureaucratic inertia, of individual determination to save lives that belonged to strangers. Captain Robert Miller's $800 modification achieved what no amount of armor plating or gun performance could accomplish. It gave American tank crews a chance to survive the worst moment of combat, when enemy fire found its mark, and the difference between life and death came down to whether ammunition would ignite or whether water would flood the compartment first. The hissing sound of escaping water glycol became, for thousands of American tankers, the sound of survival. The distinctive noise that followed German penetration, signaling that protective systems were working, that fires wouldn't follow, that evacuation might not be necessary, that tomorrow remained possible. It was the sound of engineering translated into hope, of technical specifications transformed into human futures, of calculated modifications, achieving outcomes that could be measured in the simple fact of continued existence. Sergeant William Marsh heard that sound on a July morning in 1944 and lived to tell the story. 14,000 other American tank crewmen heard similar sounds in similar moments across 2 years of combat. Their survival, multiplied by families and descendants and the accumulated weight of lives fully lived, represents the true measure of what wet stowage systems accomplished. Not just improved statistics or enhanced tactical performance, but the preservation of human possibility at the moment when it should have been consumed by fire. The German army never figured out why Sherman tanks stopped exploding when hit. They died still believing in vulnerabilities that had disappeared before D-Day, still training crews to expect ammunition fires that rarely occurred, still building tactics around assumptions that engineering had rendered obsolete. The intelligence failure cost them dearly in wasted ammunition, missed opportunities, and persistent overconfidence in tactical advantages that no longer existed. But the real story of wet ammunition storage isn't about German failure. It's about American success achieved through the unglamorous work of engineering modification and production implementation. It's about the decision to fix a known problem, rather than accept casualties as inevitable. It's about the $800 per foot tank that saved 14,000 lives and demonstrated that sometimes the most decisive advantage in war is the one your enemy never sees coming. The quiet revolution succeeded because it remained quiet, because German intelligence looked at modified Sherman tanks and saw nothing unusual, because the protection was invisible until the moment it saved lives. The tactical advantage existed in the negative space, in fires that didn't happen, in crews that didn't die, in tanks that didn't burn. History remembers dramatic victories and decisive battles, but the war was also won by the accumulated weight of small improvements that kept American forces effective when their enemies expected them to fail. Captain Robert Miller's wet stowage system represents the finest tradition of military engineering, not the pursuit of dramatic innovation or revolutionary technology, but the methodical application of existing principles to solve urgent problems. The water glycol jackets that saved 14,000 lives required no scientific breakthroughs, no exotic materials, no radical rethinking of armored vehicle design. They succeeded through careful implementation of straightforward concepts, pushed through bureaucratic resistance, by an engineer who refused to accept that men should die in preventable fires. The story deserves to be remembered, not because it's dramatic or heroic in the conventional sense, but because it demonstrates how wars are actually won, through the accumulated effort of thousands of people making countless small improvements, each one preserving a few more lives, each one creating tactical advantages that compound over time. The engineering revolution that saved 14,000 American tank crewmen happened one wet stovage system at a time, invisible to the enemy, barely noticed by the beneficiaries, achieving success through the simple fact of continued survival. In the end, the measure of wet ammunition storage's success can be stated simply: 89% of crews survived vehicle knockouts in wet stovage Sherman tanks. The remaining 11% represents tragedy, but 89% represents triumph. The triumph of engineering over chance, of methodical problem-solving over bureaucratic inertia, of individual determination to protect strangers who would never know their protector's name. Captain Robert Miller carried his brother's death telegram until the war ended, a reminder of the personal cost that drove his professional work. He never spoke publicly about the 14,000 lives his engineering saved, never sought recognition for modifications that changed the course of armoured warfare. But the tank crews who survived because of his work carried that legacy forward through decades of ordinary life that would have been impossible without water and glycol, protecting ammunition that should have killed them. The hissing sound of survival, repeated 14,000 times across 2 years of combat, represents the true sound of victory. Not the dramatic explosion of enemy tanks or the thunder of advancing armour, but the quiet activation of protective systems working exactly as designed, preventing fires that should have occurred, saving lives that should have been lost, preserving futures that should have ended in the flames that consumed so many others. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.